Montana Territory, October 1877. Nobody noticed what was happening in that dugout half a mile up the ridge. Sarah Brennan was 31 years old when her husband rode out with a promise to return before first snow. He took the wagon, the plow horse, and most of their savings. He never came back. She had 2 children, Emma, age 7, Daniel, age 4. 6 weeks until the valley typically froze over. The cabin they'd lived in for 3 seasons wasn't hers. It belonged to the claim her husband had filed. Without him, she had no legal standing. The local land office made that clear within a week. What she did have was a shovel, an iron poker, a small cook stove, and access to the mountain face behind the property line. By spring, her hole in the ground had become the warmest dwelling in the valley, and the one technique every struggling homesteader quietly studied when they thought no one was watching. If you want to see one real survival technique every week, techniques that actually worked when lives depended on it, subscribe now. And drop a comment. Where are you watching from? This is the story of how abandonment became innovation, how desperation became engineering, and how a woman no one believed in created a shelter that defied every expert in the territory. The cabin had gaps you could see daylight through. Sarah stood in the doorway on the morning of October 9th, watching the aspens lose their last yellow leaves to the wind. The stove they brought from Fort Benton was too small for the space, and the planks her husband had milled the previous summer had already started to warp. Every night, frost crept up the inside walls. Every morning, Emma woke coughing. She didn't have time to grieve. She had 41 days. The neighbors, 3 families within 5 miles, had offered help in the vague, conditional way people do when they're uncertain of the cost. If you need anything, Sarah. But need was a deep hole, and she'd learned early that people who offered help often resented those who accepted it. She nodded her thanks and kept her distance. What she needed was heat. Sustainable, reliable heat that didn't consume every stick of deadfall within walking distance. The valley families burned through cords of pine and spruce each winter, and even then, cabins hovered in the low 40s on the coldest nights. Children slept in coats. Adults woke to ice in their water buckets. Sarah had watched her neighbors for 3 years. She'd seen them haul wood until their shoulders slumped. She'd heard the complaints about cold floors, about wind stealing warmth through the floorboards, about waking to chimneys that refused to draft and rooms filled with smoke. There had to be another way. On October 11th, she walked the property line behind the cabin, the section that technically belonged to no one, since the claim ended at the tree line and the mountain began. The slope rose sharply, a mix of decomposed granite, clay, and basalt. Exposed rock jutted out in dark, jagged slabs. She put her hand on the stone. It was cold now in October, but she remembered summer. She remembered how the rock radiated heat after sunset, how it stayed warm to the touch long after the air had cooled. Thermal mass. She didn't know the term, but she understood the principle. Stone held heat. Wood didn't. If she could position her shelter so the mountain itself became the back wall, if she could burrow into the slope instead of standing apart from it, she could use the earth as insulation and the stone as a radiator. It would mean giving up the cabin. It would mean digging. It would mean building something no one in the valley had ever seen. She looked back at the cabin, at the gaps, at the thin walls, at the stove that barely kept the front room above freezing. Then she looked at her children, bundled near the fire, Daniel's lips faintly blue even in midday. She picked up the shovel. By October 13th, she'd begun excavating. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. She would carve a semi-dugout into the slope, deep enough to use the earth as insulation on 3 sides, shallow enough to avoid collapse. The back wall would be raw mountain stone. The entrance would face south, small and low to minimize heat loss. The roof would be sod and timber, thick enough to hold warmth, but light enough not to require structural support she couldn't provide. She worked in the early mornings before the children woke. She worked in the late afternoons after they'd eaten. She moved stones. She dug clay. She pried at the basalt with the iron poker, breaking off fragments, clearing space foot by foot. Her hands blistered. Her shoulders burned. She didn't stop. By October 20th, The excavation was 6 feet deep and 8 feet wide. The back wall, pure stone, radiated cold now, but Sarah knew it would reverse in winter. Once she got a fire going, that stone would absorb the heat. It would hold it. It would release it slowly, long after the flames died. She positioned the firebox carefully, not against the back wall. Too much heat would be lost in a mountain. Instead, she placed it 3 feet forward, angled so the smoke would draft naturally up and out through a clay and stone chimney she was still refining. The heat from a firebox would wash over the stone wall, warming it gradually, turning it into a thermal battery. It looked strange. It looked small. It looked like something between a root cellar and a grave. But it would work. She was certain of that. On October 23rd, Eli Cortland, a builder from 2 valleys over, rode past and stopped. He watched her for a long moment, then called out, "You're burying yourself, Mrs. Brennan." She didn't look up. "I'm staying warm, Mr. Cortland." He shook his head. "That's not a home. That's a hole. You'll suffocate in there, or the moisture will rot everything you own. You need real walls. Real timber." "I need heat," she said, "and I need it to last all night without burning a month's worth of wood." Cortland snorted. "You think dirt and stone do that? You're wasting your time." He rode off. Sarah kept digging. By November 1st, the structure was taking shape. The dugout measured 10 feet wide, 12 feet deep, and 7 feet tall at the center. Sarah had carved it directly into the slope, angling downward just enough to create a stable floor while keeping the ceiling line below the frost heave zone. The back wall, solid basalt, darkened by eons of weather, rose 8 feet and curved slightly, a natural feature of the mountain she'd chosen to work with rather than against. She left the stone exposed. No mortar, no covering, just raw rock. This was the core of her design. In a conventional cabin, heat moved through wood and lost itself to the air outside. But stone, dense, heavy stone, absorbed heat differently. It took longer to warm, but once warm, it released that energy slowly, evenly, for hours after the fire went out. She'd learned this watching the hearthstones back in her father's house in Pennsylvania. On winter nights, the flagstone around the fireplace stayed warm long after everyone had gone to bed. You could sit on it at midnight and still feel the day's fire. Here, the entire back wall would function as a hearthstone. The firebox sat 3 feet forward from the rock face, elevated slightly on a base of clay and flat stones. She'd built it small, just large enough for a modest fire, but positioned it so the flames and heat would reflect off the back wall. Convection would carry the warmth upward and forward, filling the space. Radiant heat from the stone would push outward, steady and persistent. The chimney was the hardest part. She constructed it from clay she dug near the creek, mixed with dried grass for binding, and shaped it by hand. It rose 5 feet above the roofline, angled slightly to prevent rain from entering, but wide enough to allow smoke to escape without backdrafting. She tested it 3 times, burning small fires, watching the draw. On the 3rd test, the smoke rose clean and fast. The draft was good. The roof was layered, timber poles salvaged from deadfall, then a mat of woven willow branches, then a thick layer of sod cut from the hillside. The sod was heavy, dense with roots and soil, but it was exactly what she needed. It would insulate, it would shed water, and it would add thermal mass to the ceiling, trapping heat that tried to rise and escape. The entrance was low and narrow, not by accident. Sarah knew that cold air was heavy. It sank. A small entrance, positioned carefully, would act as a baffle. Warm air would stay inside. Cold air would stay out. She'd even dug a small trench just outside the doorway. A cold sink, she called it, where the coldest air could pool and settle instead of creeping inside. The floor was earth, packed hard and covered with a layer of dry pine needles and straw. Not for comfort, though it helped, but for insulation. Air trapped in the straw would create a barrier between the ground and the living space, reducing the cold that typically crept up through conventional plank floors. It didn't look like much. From the outside, it was barely visible, just a low mound of earth and sod with a narrow entrance and a thin column of clay rising from the hill. Someone passing by might mistake it for an abandoned mining claim or a collapsed storage shed. Inside, it was something else entirely. The stone wall dominated the space. Dark, rough, ancient. It looked immovable and different. But Sarah had already tested it. She'd burned a fire for 2 hours, then placed her hand on the rock. It was warm. Not scalding, just warm like sun-baked granite in August. She'd waited 4 hours. The fire had long since died. The room had cooled slightly, but the stone was still warm. That was the proof. The mountain would hold the heat. The mountain would give it back. On November 4th, she moved the children inside. Emma looked around, uncertain. "It's so small, Mama." "It's warm," Sarah said. "That's what matters." Daniel touched the stone wall, curious. "It's like the summer rocks." Sarah smiled. Exactly like that. They spent their first night in the dugout on November 5th. Sarah burned a small fire, just enough to take the chill off, and watched the room fill with steady, even warmth. No drafts, no cold spots. The heat settled in and stayed. By midnight, the fire was out. The children were asleep, bundled under wool blankets. Sarah placed her hand on the stone wall. Still warm. She closed her eyes and let herself believe, for the first time since her husband left, that they might actually survive the winter. The valley didn't pay much attention at first. Sarah kept to herself, and most people assumed she'd left, moved in with relatives, or taken the children to Fort Benton to wait out the season. When they did see her, hauling water or gathering deadfall near the tree line, they nodded politely and moved on. It wasn't until mid-November that anyone realized where she was actually living. Eli Cortland was the first to comment. He'd ridden up to check on her, or so he claimed, and found the cabin empty. He followed the footprints in the light snow and discovered the dugout. He stood at the entrance, staring. "You're serious about this," he said. Sarah was inside, feeding the fire. "I'm surviving, Mr. Cortland." "That's not surviving. That's burying yourself alive." He shook his head. "You've got 2 children in there, in a hole. What happens when the moisture builds up? What happens when the snow gets heavy and that roof collapses?" "The roof is solid," Sarah said, "and the moisture drains. You don't know that." His voice had an edge now, something between concern and irritation. "This isn't how people live, Mrs. Brennan. This is how miners camp. This is temporary. It'll last the winter." Cortland exhaled sharply. "I hope you're right. For their sake." He gestured toward Emma and Daniel. Then he left. Word spread, not loudly, but steadily. By late November, the other families in the valley knew. Some were curious. Most were skeptical. A few were openly critical. At the Sunday gathering in the Hargrove barn, Sarah overheard the murmurs. "She's living in a hole. Not even proper cabin. Just dirt and stone. Poor woman. Doesn't know what she's doing. Someone should talk to her. That's no place to raise children." Margaret Talbot, a schoolteacher who'd been in the territory for 6 years, was more direct. She approached Sarah after the gathering, her tone careful but firm. "I'm worried about you," she said. "About the children. Are you sure that structure is safe?" "It's safe," Sarah said. "It doesn't look safe. It looks like it could cave in any day." "It won't." Margaret hesitated. "People are talking, Sarah. They're saying you've given up, that you're not thinking clearly." Sarah met her eyes. "I'm thinking very clearly, Margaret. I'm thinking about keeping my children alive. If that looks strange to people, that's their concern, not mine." Margaret softened slightly. I don't want you to suffer. If you need help, real help, there are families who could take the children for the winter, just until you're back on your feet. They're staying with me." Margaret nodded slowly, then walked away. The judgment wasn't loud. It wasn't cruel. It was just there, a quiet consensus that Sarah Brennan had made a mistake, that she was in over her head, that her shelter was desperation dressed up as ingenuity. Even the men who knew construction had doubts. Owen McCready, a carpenter who'd built half the cabins in the valley, stopped by in early December. He examined the entrance, the roof line, the chimney. Then he crouched down and looked inside. "I'll give you this," he said. "It's warmer than I expected." "Thank you," Sarah said. "But it's not going to last." He pointed at the sod roof. "That'll compact under snow. And when it does, you'll have leaks. You'll have weight. You'll have problems. I've accounted for the weight." McCready stood up, brushing dirt from his hands. "I hope so. But accounting for something and surviving it are two different things. He didn't say it with malice. He said it with the certainty of a man who'd seen structures fail, who'd watched inexperienced builders learn hard lessons. He wasn't mocking her. He just didn't believe she understood what she was doing. Sarah didn't argue. She just nodded and let him leave. The mockery, when it came, was gentler than outright hostility. It was the kind of dismissal people reserve for someone they think is misguided but harmless. A curiosity, a cautionary tale in the making. That's not a home, someone said at the trading post. That's a grave with a chimney. Laughter, not mean-spirited exactly, just dismissive. Sarah heard it. She felt it, but she didn't respond. Because the truth was, she didn't need them to believe her. She needed the shelter to work. And so far, it was working. On the coldest nights in early December, when the valley temperatures dropped into the teens, Sarah's dugout stayed above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The fire burned low and slow. The stone wall radiated warmth. The children slept without shivering. Meanwhile, her neighbors burned through cords of wood, stoked their fires every few hours, and still woke to frost on the inside of their windows. Sarah didn't tell them that. She didn't need to. Winter would tell them for her. December 18th, 1877. The temperature dropped overnight from 28 degrees to 6 below zero. By morning, it was minus 12. The storm came from the north, fast and brutal. Heavy snow, driven by wind that cut through gaps in walls and under door frames. The kind of cold that made breathing painful, that turned moisture in the air to ice crystals, that found every weakness in every structure. In the valley, families scrambled. Fireplaces roared. Stoves glowed red. Men hauled wood from sheds, splitting logs in the wind, feeding fires that seemed to devour fuel without ever warming the rooms. Women stuffed rags into gaps around windows. Children huddled close, wrapped in every blanket they owned. And still, the cold crept in. At the Hargrove place, the main room stayed at 38 degrees despite a fire that had been burning for 6 straight hours. At the Talbots, the water bucket froze solid overnight. At Owen McCrady's cabin, the chimney draft reversed in the high winds, filling the front room with smoke until he had to open the door just to breathe, letting in a wall of cold that dropped the temperature 10 degrees in minutes. It wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Margaret Talbot's youngest son, Thomas, developed a cough that wouldn't stop. Eli Cortland's wife, Grace, spent the night shivering under 4 blankets, unable to get warm. Owen McCrady burned through a week's worth of firewood in 2 days. The storm lasted 72 hours. During that time, Sarah Brennan burned 1 small fire each evening. She didn't need more than that. The dugout, buried into the mountain, shielded from the wind, insulated by earth and sod, held its warmth like a clenched fist. The stone wall absorbed heat from the modest fire and radiated it back for hours. The small entrance kept the cold air outside. The packed floor, covered in straw, prevented the ground from stealing warmth. On the first night of the storm, the interior temperature was 68 degrees. Sarah fed the fire at dusk, just a small load of dry pine and a few split logs. The flames caught quickly, filled the space with warmth, then settled into a steady burn. By the time the children were asleep, the room was comfortable. Not hot, just warm, the kind of warmth that sank into your bones and stayed. She let the fire die around midnight. By morning, the temperature inside had dropped to 52 degrees. Cold enough to feel, but nowhere near freezing. And the stone wall, the dark, silent wall at the back of the space, was still warm to the touch. Outside, it was minus 15. Sarah didn't know how the others were faring. She had no way of knowing, but she could guess. On the second night, she burned another small fire. Same routine, same results. 68 degrees at peak, 52 by morning, the stone wall holding steady. On the third night, the wind finally died. The temperature rose slightly, just enough to feel the shift. Sarah burned a fire one more time, then opened the entrance slightly to let fresh air circulate. Emma looked at her mother, eyes wide. "It's still warm, Mama." "I know," Sarah said. "The others, are they warm?" Sarah paused. "I don't know, sweetheart," but she suspected they weren't. On December 21st, the storm broke. The sky cleared. The sun returned, weak and pale, but present. Families emerged from their cabins, exhausted, running low on firewood, counting the days until spring. Owen McCready rode past the dugout later that afternoon. He didn't stop, but Sarah saw him slow his horse, saw him glance at the entrance, saw the thin wisp of smoke rising from the clay chimney. Just a wisp, not the thick, constant plume you'd expect from a family fighting to stay warm. He rode on without a word. But Sarah knew what he'd seen, and she knew what he was thinking. Stay with me, because the numbers are about to shock everyone. December 23rd. Owen McCready showed up at the dugout entrance just after dawn. Sarah was outside, breaking ice from the water bucket. She looked up surprised. McCready rarely made social calls and never this early. "Mrs. Brennan," he said. His voice was different, quieter. "I need to ask you something." "Ask," Sarah said. "How much wood did you burn during the storm?" She set down the bucket. "About a quarter cord. Maybe less." McCready stared at her. "A quarter cord. For 3 days." "That's right. I burned 2 full cords," he said. "And my front room never got above 40 degrees. Not once." He paused. "How is that possible?" Sarah gestured toward the entrance. "Come inside." McCready hesitated, then ducked through the low doorway. The first thing he noticed was the warmth. Not oppressive heat, just steady, even warmth that wrapped around in the moment he stepped in. The second thing he noticed was the stone wall. He walked over to it, placed his hand on the dark basalt. It was warm, not hot, just warm like a sun-baked rock in late summer. "You're using the mountain," he said slowly. "I'm using thermal mass," Sarah said. "The stone absorbs heat from the fire. Then it releases it, slowly, all night." McCready ran his hand along the wall, feeling the retained warmth. "How long does it hold?" 6 hours after the fire dies, it's still warm enough to feel. 8 hours, it's still radiating. He turned, looking at the small firebox, the low ceiling, the compact space. And the temperature? Last night, it was 68 degrees in here at peak. This morning, it was 52. Outside was what? 15 below. -12 when I checked. Sarah nodded. "So that's a 64-degree difference. And I only burned 1 fire." McCready exhaled slowly. He was a builder. He understood structures, materials, heat loss. What Sarah was describing shouldn't work. Not with this little fuel, not in this kind of cold. But he was standing in the proof. "The entrance," he said, noticing the narrow opening. "That's deliberate. Cold air sinks," Sarah said. "Small entrance means less mixing. Warm air stays in. I dug a trench outside, a cold sink. The coldest air pools there instead of coming inside. And the roof? The sod. Insulation. Thermal mass. It holds heat that tries to rise and escape." She pointed at the packed earthen floor. "Same with the straw on the ground. It traps air, keeps the cold from creeping up through the floor." McCready was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "I told you this wouldn't work." "I know. I was wrong." Sarah met his eyes. "You weren't the only one." Over the next week, word spread differently than before. It started with McCready. He told Eli Cortland. Cortland told the Talbots. The Talbots mentioned it to the Hargroves. By the end of December, half the valley had heard the same story. Sarah Brennan's dugout stayed warmer than any cabin in the territory, using a fraction of the wood. Some people didn't believe it. They thought McCready was exaggerating or that Sarah was embellishing. But then the measurements started. On December 28th, Margaret Talbot visited with a small thermometer she used for teaching. She wanted to see for herself. Sarah let her in, showed her the firebox, the stone wall, the design. Margaret checked the thermometer. 65 degrees inside. Outside, it was 19 degrees. 46-degree difference, Margaret said quietly. "And you haven't burned a fire since yesterday evening?" "That's right." Margaret placed her hand on the stone wall. Still warm. She looked around the space, at the earth-sheltered walls, the sod roof, the compact, efficient design, and something shifted in her expression. "I owe you an apology," she said. "You don't," Sarah replied. "I do. I thought you'd made a mistake. But this..." She gestured around the room. "This is brilliant." Sarah shook her head. "It's not brilliant. It's just practical." But Margaret wasn't the only one paying attention now. Eli Cortland came by on January 2nd. He didn't apologize. That wasn't his way, but he asked detailed questions. How deep was the excavation? What kind of stone was in the back wall? How thick was the sod on the roof? How did she prevent moisture buildup? Sarah answered each question. She had nothing to hide. She wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. She was just surviving. But Cortland took notes. By mid-January, the valley had moved past skepticism into something closer to curiosity. People want to understand how it worked. They want to know if they could replicate it. The most telling moment came on January 14th, during another cold snap. The temperature outside dropped to 8 below zero. Sarah's neighbors, families burning fires around the clock, were struggling to keep their cabins above freezing. Conventional cabins, even well-built ones, hovered in the low 30s. Poorly insulated cabins dropped into the 20s. Sarah burned her usual evening fire. Small, efficient, controlled. By morning, the dugout was 55 degrees. Owen McCready, burning fire after fire in his own cabin, had managed to keep his main room at 33 degrees. He'd used more wood in one night than Sarah used in a week. He rode up to the dugout that afternoon and said, simply, "You're using 1/3 the wood we are, maybe less." "About that," Sarah said. "And you're staying 20, 30 degrees warmer." "Sometimes more," Sarah said. "Depends on the night." McCready nodded slowly. "You've got something here, Mrs. Brennan. Something real." Sarah didn't respond. She just looked at him, waiting. "I'd like to build something similar," he said. "For my family. Would you show me how?" And there it was. The shift. Not mockery. Not dismissal. Just honest recognition that she'd solved a problem everyone else was still fighting. "I'll show you," Sarah said. By late January, the numbers were impossible to ignore. Sarah's dugout, peak temperature of 68 degrees, low of 52, using roughly 1/4 cord of wood per week. Conventional cabins in the valley, peak temperatures of 38 to 45 degrees, lows in the 20s, using 1 to 2 full cords per week. Temperature difference at peak efficiency, 76 degrees warmer than the outside air during the coldest nights. Conventional cabins managed 30 to 40 degrees at best. Fuel efficiency. Sarah was burning 1/3 to 1/4 the wood her neighbors used, while maintaining a temperature of 15 to 25 degrees higher. Heat retention. 6 to 8 hours of radiant warmth after the fire died, compared to 1 to 2 hours in a standard cabin. The mountain, silent, ancient, indifferent, had become the most efficient heating system in the territory. And Sarah Brennan, the woman they dismissed as desperate and foolish, had proven that sometimes survival requires ignoring the experts and trusting what the earth has always known. Spring arrived late in 1878. The snow lingered until mid-April, but when it finally melted, the valley began to stir with activity. Fields were plowed, fences were mended, and in 3 different locations within 5 miles of Sarah's dugout, families began to dig. Owen McCready was the first. He didn't build a full dugout. His property didn't have the right slope, but he modified his existing cabin. He dug into the hillside behind the structure, removed the back wall, and exposed the raw stone beneath. Then he repositioned his firebox, angled it to reflect heat onto the stone, and insulated the sides with packed earth. By the following winter, his main room stayed 12 degrees warmer than it had the previous year, using half the wood. Eli Cortland went further. He excavated a full semi-dugout on the south-facing slope of his property, almost identical to Sarah's design. Stone back wall, sod roof, small entrance, cold sink trench. He moved his family in by November. The Talbots didn't dig, but they rebuilt. They tore down one wall of their cabin and replaced it with stacked stone, then built a firebox designed to radiate heat into the rock. It wasn't as efficient as a full dugout, but it worked. Margaret Talbot wrote in her journal that winter, "We are warmer this year than we have ever been, and we are burning less wood." Sarah Brennan was right. By the winter of 1879, 11 families in the valley had adopted some version of earth-sheltered or thermal mass design. Some are full dugouts. Some are hybrid cabins with stone walls and sod roofs. Some were simple modifications, a repositioned firebox, a stone heat sink, a narrow entrance with a cold air trap. But they all traced back to the same source. A woman who'd been abandoned, who'd been dismissed, who'd quietly built something that worked. Sarah didn't advertise. She didn't teach formal classes or charge for advice. But when people came to her with questions, and they did, often, she answered. She showed them the principles. Thermal mass, insulation, minimizing exposed surface area, using the earth as a resource, not an obstacle. She was patient. She was precise. And she never once said, "I told you so." By 1881, the dugout style had spread beyond the immediate valley. Prospectors in the mountains to the west were building similar shelters. Homesteaders in the eastern plains were adapting the principles to their flat, windswept land, digging deeper, using sod more aggressively, building earth berms to shield their cabins from the relentless wind. The technique didn't have a formal name. People just called it building like Sarah or the Brennan method. Some called it mountain housing. Others called it dugout living, though that missed the point. It wasn't about living underground. It was about working with the land instead of against it. Sarah Brennan never became famous. Her name didn't appear in territorial records or homesteading guides. But in the valleys and foothills of Montana Territory, among the families who survived the brutal winters of the late 1870s and early 1880s, she became something more important than famous. She became a reference point. You should talk to Sarah. Sarah built hers this way. Sarah would know. In 1883, a surveyor from the territorial government visited the valley to assess infrastructure needs. He noted in his report, a significant portion of the dwellings in this region utilize earth shelter design with exposed stone thermal walls. Fuel consumption appears markedly lower than in comparable settlements. Residents attribute this to local innovation. Local innovation. That was the phrase that stuck. Not desperation, not stubbornness. Innovation. By the mid-1880s, Sarah's children were older. Emma was 13, Daniel was 10. They helped with the chores, the firewood, the endless tasks of frontier life. And they grew up in a home that stayed warm, that didn't consume half their waking hours feeding fires, that gave them space to be children instead of just survivors. Sarah never remarried. She filed her own claim in 1880, once the territorial laws changed to allow single women to hold land. She built a small addition to the dugout, a storage room, a sleeping alcove for the children, but she never abandoned the core design. Why would she? It worked. In the winter of 1885, a journalist from Helena visited the valley, researching an article on homesteading practices. He interviewed Sarah, toured the dugout, and took notes on the design. He asked her the question everyone always asked, why did you build it this way when everyone said it wouldn't work? Sarah's answer was simple, because I didn't have the luxury of being wrong. The article was published in March 1886. It described the dugout in technical detail, praised its efficiency, and noted that Mrs. Brennan's shelter remains one of the warmest and most fuel-efficient dwellings in the territory, despite its unconventional appearance. The article also included a quote from Owen McCready. She wasn't being stubborn. She was being practical, and she understood something the rest of us didn't, that the mountain wasn't an obstacle. It was a tool. That quote spread farther than the article itself. It became a kind of shorthand for the entire philosophy behind earth-sheltered building. Work with the land. Use what's there. Don't fight the environment. Understand it. By 1890, Sarah's dugout was 12 years old. The sod roof had been replaced twice. The chimney had been rebuilt once. But the core structure, the excavation, the stone wall, the compact design, remained unchanged. It still stayed warm. It still used a fraction of the wood that conventional cabins required. It still worked. And in valleys and foothills across Montana Territory, in settlement from the Rockies to the plains, families were still building shelters that looked a little like Sarah's. Not exact copies. Every site was different. Every builder made modifications. But the principles were the same. Thermal mass, insulation, minimal exposure, work with the earth. The wisdom wasn't new. Indigenous peoples have been building earth-sheltered homes for centuries. Sod houses dotted the plains. Pit houses were common in colder climates. What Sarah had done wasn't invent a technique. It was rediscover a principle that had always been true. Stone holds heat. Earth insulates. Small spaces are easier to warm than large ones. The frontier had a way of stripping away the unnecessary and revealing what actually mattered. Sarah Brennan, abandoned and alone, had been forced to strip away everything: pride, convention, the need to look respectable, and build only what worked. And what worked, it turned out, was ancient, not primitive, not backwards, just true. In the winter of 1891, Sarah sat by her fire, still small, still efficient, and watched the flames reflect off the stone wall. Emma was married now, living 2 valleys over. Daniel was apprenticed to a surveyor in Helena. The dugout was quiet, but it was warm. Outside, the temperature had dropped to 5 below zero. Inside, it was 63 degrees. The stone wall radiated steady heat. The fire burned low and slow. And Sarah Brennan, the woman no one had believed in, closed her eyes and let herself rest. She'd survived. More than that, she'd built something that lasted. Not because she wanted to prove anyone wrong, but because she couldn't afford to be wrong. And sometimes, that's where the best ideas come from. Sarah Brennan's dugout stood for 23 years before it was finally abandoned. By then, she'd moved to a larger homestead closer to her daughter's family. The shelter remained intact, still warm, still functional, until a landslide in 1901 buried the entrance. But the principles she'd proven didn't disappear. They spread. They evolved. They became part of the knowledge base that settlers carried with them, that builders referenced, that families relied on when winters turned brutal and fuel ran short. Earth-sheltered housing, thermal mass design, passive solar orientation. These weren't fringe ideas or experimental theories. They were proven techniques, tested in the harshest conditions, refined by people who couldn't afford to fail. Sarah Brennan wasn't an engineer. She wasn't a scientist. She was a woman who needed to keep her children alive and who understood, instinctively, desperately, that the answers she needed were already in the land. The mountain had always known how to hold heat. She just had to listen. Today, we talk about energy efficiency, about sustainable building, about working with the environment instead of against it. We act like these are modern insights, innovations born from recent awareness. But they're not new. They're ancient. And people like Sarah Brennan proved they worked long before anyone thought to write them down. So here's the lesson. When the stakes are high and resources are scarce, listen to the land. Study what's already there. Trust what's been tested by time, by cold, by necessity. Because the best solutions aren't always the ones that look impressive. Sometimes they're the ones that just work. Now it's your turn. Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever survived? And if you want more stories like this, real survival techniques that actually worked when lives depended on them, subscribe now. Every week, we bring you one piece of forgotten wisdom that might just change how you think about shelter, heat, and survival. See you in the next one. Educational note. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. Characters, names, and specific events are fictional, while the techniques, concepts, and principles discussed are based on real historical practices and well-established physical or practical knowledge. Any modern application should be evaluated according to current standards, safety guidelines, and applicable laws or regulations. This content is educational in nature and does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.